22, The Circle. We were up early the next day, unsure of where to begin a day without running. Very quickly, though, the work of the main camp took over. We spent the morning in assigned chores, gathering water from the rain barrels to boil, coaxing the small vegetables in the garden to stay alive, washing clothes, checking the trap lines. Soon it was lunch and everyone came together in the clearing to eat. You guys planning a rescue for your elder? Clarence had sat beside me in a spot where the grass was soft. He was eating dried meat. I had made him promise earlier to teach me how to dry and to smoke meat so we could keep it longer when the hunt wasn't so good. I nodded, not wanting to talk anymore since the asshole from yesterday had sauntered over. Clarence followed my gaze to the boy. This is my nephew, Derek, he told me. We traveled together from out west. He's a good hunter. By then he was standing in front of us. I had tried to put my hand up along my brow to block the sun out to see him. I didn't like it looking up at him. I wanted to stand, but I didn't want him to think I needed to get up to prove anything. The best, Uncle. I'm the best hunter. He smirked and lightly kicked the bottom of Clarence's boot with the toe of his own. Yeah, and he's real humble too, Clarence laughed. Derek, you know Jean's boy, Francis, eh? French, I corrected. Yeah, sure. I know Francis. I escorted him over here yesterday. He made air quotes around the word escorted. Whatever, big man with a gun. I decided to ignore him, looking down at my own bowl of salted potatoes. He didn't deserve my attention. No, Francis, I'm a big man always. Don't need a gun, though I am capable of using one when I have to. Clarence cut the boy off. Okay, Derek, why don't you get yourself some food over there? Yeah, I think I will go get some food, Uncle. I have to check the lines this afternoon. Someone has to feed the women. He stretched out his arm and puffed out his chest before leaving, blocking out the sun so that I was thrown into his shadow. Don't mind him. He's just looking for something to rub his antlers on, you know what I mean? Clarence clapped me on the back. Plus, you have girls in your group. He's just looking to prove himself. He ripped off another hunk of meat and chewed it thoughtfully, looking around the clearing. Suddenly, I wasn't hungry anymore. I swallowed what was in my mouth and excused myself. I handed my bowl off to Slopper and a smaller boy his age named Sam, who were the designated dishwashers for the meal, and wandered over to the lodge, planning to walk the perimeter of the clearing just to check things out. I still felt uneasy. Maybe I just needed to get a better handle on where we were and what was ahead of us. I sure as hell didn't want to think about where we'd been and what I'd done. And now we were here with this group. And there was this ass who was trying to impress the girls by being a dick to me. What was up with that? I walked at a brisk pace to avoid the others. I needed to think. Hey, wait for me. Rose jogged over. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun that bounced like a pom-pom on a toque as she ran. I kept walking, a little slower than before. Where are you going? She caught up and walked beside me. Thanks for waiting, geez. Nowhere. She walked at my pace, swinging her arms and kicking at rocks along the way. I made my way over to where the hill started its incline, dotted with low shrubs and a thin veil of elm trees. Well, what are you doing? Nothing. Nothing? I just nodded, making my way through the bush, but still behind the trees, so that I had a better view of the green bowl in the clearing. Why did things still feel so uncertain, even after I'd found my dad? It had been years since I'd even allowed myself the fantasy of imagining he was still alive, and yet, here we were, together, and still... I didn't realize until I had walked a few feet that Rose was no longer with me. I turned and saw her there at the bottom, arms crossed, hip thrown out. You coming? Well, do you want me to? I shrugged. Up to you. She unfolded her arms and placed them on her hips. Then she turned on her heel and stomped away. I shrugged again and walked in the opposite direction. Tonight's social night over in the cave. General was visiting with Miigwans, and when I returned to our group circle of tents, they were chatting in the last moments of daylight. General was a pleasant-looking man who wore his gray hair at shoulder length and had a neck hung with beaded ropes. He smiled a lot, the kind of smile that went right up into the eyes. And maybe for this reason alone, I agreed to follow them over to the cave to check out the festivities. When we got there, they were still cleaning up and placing seating in a circle, facing inward towards the center of the space. I excused myself from the two men and made my way over to my father's room. Since the door was a blanket and the walls were mostly fabric, I knocked on the wooden frame around the draped doorway. Dad? Come in. He was sitting on his bed, wrapping his damaged leg in a tensor bandage. He smiled when I entered. He was wearing a long undershirt that had been black at one time, but it was now faded to gray, and what looked like a pair of tropical print swimming trunks that hung wide on his thighs. His damp hair was freshly cut, and he smelled like good soap. Boy, I could get used to hearing Dad again, let me tell you. He patted the mattress beside him, and I sat down, sighing as I did. We sat there for a minute in silence. Boy, what's the matter? I couldn't answer. Instead, I shrugged again, slumping my own shoulders after so I could put my elbows on my knees and hold my face in my hands. You sure look like something's the matter. I couldn't answer him because I wasn't really sure what was wrong. On top of that, I felt guilty I wasn't happier. We'd found Minerva, and all we had to do was go get her from the recruiters. And I found my dad after all this time. It was really two miracles in one, and all I could do was feel sad and confused. Dad finished wrapping up his stump and leaned back on his elbows. French, can you tell me something? Sure, Dad. What is it you're hoping to find out here? I answered too quickly. Minerva. No, I mean, why Minerva? I was getting irritated. What do you mean, why? Because she was taken. I spent the first 2 years in the bush trying to find Mitch after he was taken. Because that's what we do. We look for each other. Didn't you bother to look for us? I regretted it as soon as I'd said it. I did, son. His voice was low, but calm, every day. He rubbed a memory of an injury on the side of his ribs. No matter what. I didn't set up this camp to be my community, Francis. I brought these people together so we could find our community. But eventually, that's what we became in the absence of the other. But it doesn't mean that we stopped searching. I didn't understand what he said. I didn't understand until he said it that I didn't understand until he said it that part of my Ianai had been resentment. Resentment that my father was out here being all revolutionary while his kids were left with an unstable mother who eventually left us all alone. That I hated him for leaving Mitch to sacrifice himself for me. That I was angry about my childhood left to wither and starve in the woods. He put an arm around my shoulders and shook me a bit as he spoke. No one could have guessed the speed and cruelty of this machine once it started up. No one knew what was coming. If I had, I never would have left that day. I would have taken you and your brother and your ma and run north as fast as I could while I still had both legs. I leaned into his side and just lay there for a minute, listening to the pull and thump of his broken heart against my hard head. I've done things, Dad. He hummed, low in his chest that it filled my ear with cotton. We all have, son. He kissed the top of my head like he used to when I was little, and I felt that good sense of safety once more, even just for a minute. The blanket at the door was pulled back. Hey, you guys coming or what? A young man I hadn't seen before popped his head into the room, then popped back out. We heard his feet hurry away, and there was a sound I hadn't heard since I was young. So young that all I remember is the sound, and not where I was, or who I was with, or when I heard it. It was the sound of a drum. They hit the drum tentatively at first, checking it for tone and pitch. We passed the food prep area. I saw Clarence holding it over the home simmered with, a hole in the dirt ground filled with heated rocks from the fire outside. It was a hand drum, and he held it by the sinew ties crisscrossing the back, tilting it towards the heat to tighten the skin over the front. We made our way to the circle of seats, and my father took one beside Bullet. I stood on the other side of Dad and looked around. Most of the seats were taken. Half a dozen little kids chased each other in and around the adults, who watched with smiles. Bullet seemed to be the oldest one here, and she couldn't have been more than 65. There were about 50 people in total, a big enough group that invisibility, the way that we enjoyed it, was out of the question. So they had to live differently, carving out communities in the spaces they felt they could defend. It was a precious existence, to say the least. Precarious existence, to say the least, sorry. Finally, Clarence walked into the center of the circle, clearing his throat in sharp breaths. I liked Clarence and was happy to see him, but then he motioned to someone in the crowd with his drumstick. I looked over to see Derek, also holding a drum. Damn it. Even worse, standing beside him was Rose. He smiled at her, and she returned the smile before he joined his uncle. The cave darkened as my eyes narrowed. What in the hell was she doing with that jerk? And why was she smiling so big? I puffed out my chest a bit, remembering that I still had the longest braids, even in this group. That made me a better Indian, after all. But then the drumming started. Double beat, high and sweet, round dance style. Clarence busted a lead, and then Derek joined in, and damn it all to hell, his voice was amazing. I crossed my arms, refusing to be impacted. My dad tapped his hand on his mangled knee, and Bullet rocked forward and back to the beat. A few of the younger adults stood right away and joined hands, circling the singers in a chain. Some others joined in, and soon the circle was filled with dancers. I kept my arms folded when the clapping and hollering started after that first song. I felt a jealous twitch in my midsection when Wob and She-Boy and Slopper, and everyone else for that matter, joined in. The twitch turned into a wrench when Clarence raised his voice to declare the next one was two-step, and Derek handed his drum to Tree. This elicited oohs and ahs from the twins, who put their heads together to examine and admire the instrument. It twisted and yanked on my stomach when I saw Derek weave through the audience to extend his hand towards Rose, who shook her head at first and giggled, but eventually put her hand in his and allowed herself to be led out into the center. And finally, the jealousy turned to full-blown murder stomping about my guts when I saw them dance, hand in hand, around the circle. By the time they were facing me, Derek looked me straight in the eyes and smiled the biggest smirk of self-satisfaction you could ever imagine. I turned and left the warmth of the circle, jogging down the corridor and retreating into the dark corner of our camp.